In the winter of 1873, the German immigrant community of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whispered about 11-year-old Emma Richter in hushed, fearful tones. This pale, quiet child could calculate the day of the week for any date in human history within seconds, memorize entire conversations word for word after hearing them just once, and recite the precise number of steps between any two buildings in her neighborhood. What modern science might recognize as an extraordinary neurological condition was, to the people of 1873, either a divine blessing or something far more sinister. But when Emma began using her remarkable abilities to reveal buried secrets, predict deadly accidents, and recite intimate details of crimes that supposedly no living person had witnessed, the community's amazement turned to terror. By spring, 3 men would be dead, a family would flee in the night, and Emma Richter herself would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a leather journal filled with numbers that no one dared to decode. Before we continue with the chilling story of Emma Richter and the dark secrets her extraordinary mind uncovered in Milwaukee's German Quarter, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most haunting historical mysteries every week. And let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. What the residents of Brewery Town didn't realize was that Emma's gift would expose a web of lies, betrayal and murder that had been carefully hidden for nearly a decade, and that her mathematical precision would become their community's most terrifying nightmare. Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873 was a bustling enclave of red brick breweries, modest wooden homes, and the constant sound of German voices mixing with English in the crisp Wisconsin air. The community of nearly 8,000 German immigrants had built their own little Bavaria along the shores of Lake Michigan, complete with beer gardens, traditional bakeries, and the familiar rhythms of old-world life transplanted to American soil. The men worked in the breweries, Schlitz, Best, and the dozens of smaller operations that made Milwaukee famous, while their wives tended gardens that yielded the same vegetables their grandmothers had grown in the Rhineland. Heinrich and Greta Richter had arrived from Bavaria in 1861 with dreams of prosperity and their infant daughter Emma. Heinrich found steady work as a brewmaster at the Kellner Brewery, a mid-sized operation that supplied beer to the growing city's thirsty population. Greta took in laundry and mending to supplement their income, her nimble fingers working by candlelight long after Emma had been put to bed in their small but tidy home on Galena Street. The Richters were unremarkable in every way except for their daughter. Emma had been born during the harsh Atlantic crossing, 3 weeks premature and so small that the ship's doctor doubted she would survive the journey. But survive she did, though she remained slight and pale, with enormous grey eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unsettling intensity. As a toddler, she rarely cried or demanded attention, content to sit quietly in corners, watching and listening as the adult world unfolded around her. By age 4, Emma's parents began to notice something unusual. She could recite entire conversations she had overheard days earlier, complete with the precise inflections and accents of the speakers. She counted everything, the number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps from their front door to the bakery, the exact time between the brewery whistles that marked the beginning and end of each workday. When Heinrich taught her basic arithmetic, she absorbed mathematical concepts with frightening speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could work them out on paper. The German community initially viewed Emma's abilities with a mixture of pride and unease. Old Mrs. Brennan, who claimed to remember the witch trials in her grandmother's stories, crossed herself whenever Emma's calculating grey eyes fixed on her. But Father Koller, the stout Bavarian priest who served their small Catholic parish, declared Emma's gifts to be a blessing from God, a child chosen to demonstrate divine wisdom in their New World community. The winter of 1872 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping so low that Lake Michigan froze solid for the first time in a generation. The brewery workers huddled around coal stoves, their breath visible even indoors, while their wives struggled to keep their families warm and fed through the long, bitter months. It was during this isolated winter that Emma's abilities began to take on a darker character, though no one yet understood what was coming. Emma had developed the habit of sitting by the small window in their kitchen, watching the neighbors go about their daily routines with the same intense focus she applied to mathematical problems. She began to notice patterns, not just in numbers, but in human behavior. Mr. Kruger always walked to the brewery by the same route, taking exactly 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when he took a different path that required 284 steps. Mrs. Fisher hung her laundry in a specific sequence, but when her husband worked late at the mill, she changed the order completely. These observations might have been dismissed as the quirks of an unusual child, except that Emma began to vocalize her findings in ways that made the adults increasingly uncomfortable. The transformation from curiosity to dread began on a grey February morning in 1873. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, methodically eating her breakfast, while her mother prepared her father's lunch pail, when she suddenly looked up and announced, "Mr. Dietrich will not come home from the brewery today. He will die at exactly 14 minutes past 2 o'clock. Greta Richter nearly dropped the tin pail she was holding. Emma, mein Gott, what a terrible thing to say. Why would you think such a thing? Emma's grey eyes remained fixed on her mother's face with that unsettling intensity. He has been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday he drank 3 times more than usual. His steps were uneven, 251 instead of his normal 244. When people change their patterns by more than 10%, something significant happens within 72 hours. Mr. Dietrich's pattern changed by 12%. The calculation is simple. Heinrich, who had been putting on his heavy wool coat, stopped and stared at his daughter. Johann Dietrich was indeed a drinker, but no more than half the men in the German quarter. The idea that Emma had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking habits was disturbing enough, but her calm, mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through both parents that had nothing to do with the Wisconsin winter. "You must not say such things, Emma," Heinrich said firmly. "It's not proper for a child to speak of death." Emma simply nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her parents exchanged worried glances over her bent head. They had grown accustomed to their daughter's unusual observations, but this felt different, darker and more specific than her typical mathematical pronouncements. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 that afternoon, Johann Dietrich collapsed in the brewery's malt room. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by what Dr. Muller determined to be chronic alcohol poisoning. The brewery workers who found him noted that he had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily than usual and showing signs of severe anxiety. But what truly unsettled them was the timing. Emma Richter's prediction had been accurate to the minute. Word of Emma's grim prophecy spread through the German quarter like smoke from a chimney fire. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the calculating eyes and began to wonder what else she might have observed during her silent vigils at the kitchen window. The Richter family found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances when they walked to church or visited the market. Father Koller, who had previously praised Emma's gifts as divine, now seemed less certain. When Heinrich approached him after Sunday Mass, seeking guidance about his daughter's disturbing prediction, the priest's jovial demeanor had been replaced by something approaching concern. "Heinrich, my friend," Father Koller said, his Bavarian accent thick with worry. "Perhaps it would be best if young Emma spent less time watching the neighbors and more time with her prayers. The Lord gives us gifts, yes, but sometimes the devil can twist even the most innocent abilities toward darker purposes." This suggestion troubled Heinrich deeply. He had always been a practical man, more concerned with the science of brewing than the mysteries of faith. But even he could not dismiss the unsettling accuracy of Emma's prediction. That evening he sat his daughter down for a serious conversation. "Emma, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dietrich? Emma looked at her father with those enormous gray eyes, her expression as calm and analytical as always. I watch. I count. I remember. Mr. Dietrich's behavior changed in predictable ways. When someone increases their alcohol consumption by 37% over a 17-day period, while simultaneously reducing their food intake by approximately 20%, cardiac stress becomes inevitable. I calculated the most probable time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms. Heinrich felt his blood run cold. His 11-year-old daughter was speaking like a physician, or something far more troubling. But Emma, how could you know all these details about Mr. Dietrich's eating and drinking? I observe everything, Papa. Every day, every person, every pattern. Emma's voice remained matter-of-fact, but there was something in her eyes that made Heinrich deeply uncomfortable. Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I've made? Heinrich quickly shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about their neighbors' lives and deaths. But as he tucked Emma into bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his family was standing at the edge of something much darker than a simple mathematical curiosity. The February snow continued to fall outside their small house, muffling the sounds of the German quarter and creating an insulated world where secrets could be hidden and observations could be made without detection. Emma lay quietly in her narrow bed, her mathematical mind processing the day's data and calculating probabilities that no 11-year-old should be able to comprehend, and certainly no 11-year-old should want to know. In the weeks following Johann Dietrich's death, the atmosphere in Milwaukee's German quarter shifted like the wind off Lake Michigan. Emma continued her daily observations, but now her parents watched her with growing unease as she sat by the kitchen window, her gray eyes tracking the movements of their neighbors with mechanical precision. The child who had once been their pride had become a source of deep, gnawing worry. The brewing community was tight-knit by necessity. The men relied on each other for work, their wives for companionship during the long winters, and their children played together in the narrow streets between the red brick buildings. But Emma had never quite fit into this social fabric. While other children played games and told stories, she preferred to sit alone, counting and calculating and watching the world around her with that unsettling intensity. Greta began to notice that Emma's observations were becoming more detailed and more disturbing. The child would mention casually that Mrs. Weber had been meeting secretly with Mr. Kellner behind the brewery on Tuesday afternoons for 6 weeks, or that the Schneider family had been burying something in their back garden every Sunday after church. When Greta asked how Emma could possibly know such things, the girl would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the probabilities. People think they are being secret, Emma said one March morning as she methodically buttered her bread, but they follow patterns just like numbers. Mrs. Weber always tells her husband she's visiting her sister on Tuesday afternoons, but she takes 127 steps to Mr. Kellner's house instead of 349 steps to her sister's. The Schneiders bury objects wrapped in cloth exactly 73 centimeters apart in a grid pattern. They believe no one is watching, but I am always watching. Heinrich had heard enough. That evening, after Emma was asleep, he spoke seriously with his wife about their daughter's increasingly troubling behavior. Greta, this cannot continue. Emma is becoming unnatural. Children should not observe such things, and they certainly should not speak of them so coldly. Greta nodded, her hands trembling as she mended one of Heinrich's work shirts. I'm frightened, Heinrich. Not of Emma, but of what people will think. Already the neighbors look at us strangely. Mrs. Brennan crossed the street yesterday when she saw me coming, and Father Koller. He has not visited us since Johann's death. Their fears proved justified when, 3 days later, Emma made another of her mathematical announcements. She was helping her mother prepare dinner when she suddenly stopped peeling potatoes and looked up with that familiar calculating expression. Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11:30 in the morning. Her husband will find her with Mr. Kellner in the brewery office. There will be violence. Greta dropped her paring knife. "Emma, 9. You must not say such things." But Emma continued with the same mathematical certainty she applied to her arithmetic lessons. "Mrs. Weber has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week for 6 weeks. Mr. Kellner has been staying 33 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Mr. Weber will return from his delivery route 47 minutes early because his horse is developing lameness in her left front leg. I have observed her gait deteriorating for 11 days. The convergence of these 3 variables makes discovery inevitable." Heinrich, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with dread. His daughter was not just observing their neighbors, she was predicting their futures with terrifying accuracy. "Emma, how do you know about Mr. Weber's horse?" "I count her steps when she passes our house. On March 1st, she favored her right legs 53% of the time. Today it was 68%. Tomorrow the lameness will be severe enough to slow the delivery route by 47 minutes, causing Mr. Weber to return early." The next day unfolded exactly as Emma had calculated. Wilhelm Weber discovered his wife Anna in a compromising position with brewery owner Ernst Kellner. The confrontation that followed left Kellner with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs, while Anna Weber was beaten so severely that Dr. Müller had to be summoned. The scandal rocked the tight-knit German community, but what disturbed people even more was the growing realization that little Emma Richter had somehow predicted the entire sequence of events. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Johann Dietrich's death, but had also foreseen the Weber-Kellner scandal with unsettling precision. People began to whisper about the strange child who sat at her window, watching and calculating and somehow knowing things that no child should know. The Richter family found themselves increasingly isolated. Former friends avoided them at church. Children were forbidden from playing near their house, and even the shopkeepers in the German quarter began to treat them with barely concealed suspicion. Heinrich's position at the brewery became tenuous. His fellow workers viewed him with unease, and Ernst Kellner, still recovering from his beating, made it clear that the Richter family was no longer welcome at company social events. But Emma seemed oblivious to the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with mechanical precision. She began keeping a leather journal, filling its pages with numbers, dates, and observations that her parents dared not read. The sight of their 11-year-old daughter bent over her calculations, writing in neat columns of figures, filled them with a dread they could not name. As winter gave way to spring, the isolation deepened. The German quarter that had once felt like home now seemed hostile and threatening. Heinrich began to consider the unthinkable, leaving Milwaukee, abandoning the life they had built, and starting over somewhere far from the whispers and the fear and the terrible accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Emma was not finished with her calculations. The worst was yet to come, and her mathematical mind had already begun processing the data that would lead to the darkest secrets of all. As April arrived in Milwaukee, bringing with it the first tentative warmth after the brutal winter, Emma's journal grew thicker with her precise notations. The leather-bound book had become her constant companion, and she filled its pages with increasingly complex calculations that went far beyond simple mathematics. Her parents caught glimpses of charts tracking human behavior patterns, tables of numerical sequences they couldn't understand, and detailed maps of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements. The community's fear of Emma had begun to manifest in more concrete ways. Children were forbidden from walking past the Richter house. Shopkeepers served the family quickly and without conversation, and even Father Koller had begun limiting his interactions with them to formal church services. But Emma's isolation only seemed to sharpen her observational skills, as if the removal of normal social distractions allowed her unusual mind to focus more intently on the mathematical patterns she perceived in human behavior. Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community's physician, had grown increasingly curious about Emma's abilities. Unlike the superstitious whispers of the neighbors, Dr. Muller approached the situation with scientific interest. He had studied medicine in Berlin before immigrating to America, and had encountered cases of unusual mental capabilities in his practice. When Heinrich Richter approached him privately, seeking medical advice about his daughter's condition, Dr. Muller agreed to examine Emma. The examination took place on a rainy Thursday morning in Dr. Muller's office above the pharmacy on Water Street. Emma submitted to the doctor's questions and tests with the same mathematical precision she applied to everything else, answering each inquiry with detailed accuracy, while her grey eyes remained fixed on some invisible calculation. "Emma," Dr. Muller said in his accented English, "your father tells me you can predict when certain events will happen. Can you explain to me how you do this?" Emma looked at the doctor with that unsettling intensity. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities based on established behavioral data. People believe their actions are random, but they follow mathematical sequences. When I have sufficient data points, I can predict future behavior with high accuracy." Dr. Muller leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Can you give me an example?" Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of neat numerical notations. "Mrs. Brennan believes she is keeping a secret, but her pattern is quite obvious. Every Tuesday and Friday for 8 weeks, she has walked to the church at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. But instead of entering for prayer, she continues to the rectory and remains for precisely 43 minutes. Father Collar's pattern has also changed. He has been purchasing extra candles and wine, and his evening prayers have extended by an average of 17 minutes on Tuesdays and Fridays. The correlation is statistically significant." Dr. Muller felt his breath catch. The implications of what Emma was suggesting about the priest and the widow were scandalous enough, but the methodical way she had documented her observations was deeply troubling. "Emma, how long have you been watching people in this way?" "Always," Emma replied simply. "Since I was very small, but I only began making calculations when I learned mathematics. The patterns became clearer then." After the examination, Dr. Muller spoke privately with Heinrich and Greta Richter. His medical training told him that Emma's condition was neurological rather than supernatural, but he had no framework for understanding what he had observed. "Your daughter's mind works differently than other children's," he explained. "She processes information in ways that seem almost mechanical. In my opinion, this is a medical condition, not the other things people are saying." But even Dr. Muller's scientific perspective couldn't diminish the growing dread that surrounded Emma's predictions. 2 days after his examination, Emma made another of her calculated announcements. "There will be a fire at the Zimmerman house on Sunday evening. It will start at 8:47 and spread to 3 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond. Mr. Zimmerman will not survive." Heinrich felt the familiar chill that accompanied his daughter's predictions. "Emma, you must not say such things. How could you possibly know about a fire?" Emma consulted her journal. "Mr. Zimmerman has been drinking lamp oil mixed with whiskey for 12 days. I observed him purchasing both items in quantities that exceed normal household use. His wife left for Chicago to visit her sister yesterday, which follows the pattern of wives leaving before significant domestic incidents occur. The chimney on their house has structural damage that I calculated based on the angle of smoke emission and the pattern of soot deposits. The probability of fire is 93%. Greta began to weep softly. The clinical way Emma discussed potential tragedy, as if human suffering were simply another mathematical problem to be solved, frightened her more than any supernatural explanation would have. This was her child, but she no longer recognized the cold precision in Emma's voice or the mechanical way she processed human pain. Heinrich made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to warn Franz Zimmermann about Emma's prediction, hoping that preventive action might save a life and perhaps demonstrate that his daughter's calculations could be used for good rather than simply predicting disaster. He found Zimmermann at the brewery Saturday evening, stumbling drunk and reeking of the lamp oil Emma had mentioned. Heinrich's warning was met with belligerent laughter and crude jokes about the devil child who thinks she knows everything. But something in Heinrich's desperation must have penetrated Zimmerman's alcoholic haze, because he promised to be extra careful with the lamps. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth and a dry wind from the west. At exactly 8:47, flames erupted from the Zimmerman house. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming not just the original building, but 3 adjacent homes before the volunteer fire brigade could mount an effective response. Franz Zimmerman's body was found in his kitchen, where he had apparently fallen while trying to extinguish flames that had spread far beyond his ability to control. The accuracy of Emma's prediction, down to the exact minute, sent shockwaves through the German quarter. Heinrich's attempt to warn Zimmerman had been witnessed by several brewery workers, and word spread quickly that Emma had predicted not just the fire, but its precise timing and consequences. The community's unease transformed into open fear, and the Richter family found themselves completely ostracized. But for Emma, the fire was simply another data point to be recorded in her journal. She noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual event, made adjustments to her calculations based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her prediction possible in the first place. The worst part was that she was not finished calculating. The days following the Zimmerman fire transformed the German quarter into a place of whispered fears and sideways glances. Emma's prediction had been too precise, too detailed, and too accurate to be dismissed as coincidence. 3 families, the Brauns, the Kohlers, and the Steiners, had lost their homes in the blaze, and the community was struggling to house the displaced families while trying to process the unsettling reality of Emma's mathematical prophecies. Heinrich found his position at the brewery had become untenable. His fellow workers avoided him. Conversation stopped when he entered a room, and Ernst Kellner, still bearing the marks of Wilhelm Weber's attack, made it clear that the Richter family's presence was no longer welcome in any brewery social functions. The mathematical precision of Emma's predictions had transformed their daughter from a curiosity into something the community feared to name. Emma herself seemed unaware of the growing hostility around her. She continued her daily observations, filling page after page of her leather journal with calculations that grew increasingly complex and disturbing. She had begun creating what appeared to be probability matrices, tracking multiple variables simultaneously and generating predictions that extended weeks into the future. Greta found herself afraid to look at her daughter's journal, terrified of what calculations Emma might be making about their own family or neighbors. The child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety. Emma's matter-of-fact discussions of human tragedy, her clinical observations about people's most private behaviors, and her mechanical processing of information that should have evoked emotional responses all contributed to a growing sense that something fundamental had been lost or damaged in her daughter's mind. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Emma was sitting at her usual place by the kitchen window, watching the street activity with her characteristic intensity, when she suddenly looked up at her mother with those calculating grey eyes. "Mama, there is something wrong with the pattern today." Greta, who was preparing bread for baking, felt her hands begin to tremble. "What do you mean, Emma?" Emma consulted her journal, flipping through pages of numerical notations with practiced efficiency. "Every Tuesday for 11 weeks, Mrs. Brennan has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15. But today she left her house at 2:47 and walked toward the river instead. Her behavior indicates significant distress. Her step length decreased by 12%, and her breathing pattern was irregular. This suggests she is planning something final." The clinical way Emma discussed Mrs. Brennan's apparent suicidal intentions filled Greta with horror. "Emma, you must not speak of such things. Mrs. Brennan is a good woman. She would never. The mathematical probability is 87%. Emma interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while displaying physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of the pattern change. Mrs. Brennan's pattern changed 43 minutes ago. Greta felt the world tilting around her. The realization that her 11-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with mathematical precision was more than she could bear. She dropped her bread dough and ran to find Heinrich, who was in their small garden behind the house, trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. "Heinrich, you must come quickly. Emma says Mrs. Brennan is going to harm herself. We must do something." Heinrich looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar dread that had become their constant companion. They found Emma still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her journal as if recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy. "Emma, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Brennan." Emma looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her established Tuesday pattern by 28 minutes. Her physical indicators suggested severe emotional distress. Based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, the probability of self-harm is 87%, with peak likelihood occurring between 5 and 7 this evening. Heinrich made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Emma's abilities. He left the house immediately and went searching for Margaret Brennan, following the route toward the river that Emma had indicated. He found the elderly widow standing on the dock where the fishing boats tied up, staring into the dark water with an expression of profound despair. "Mrs. Brennan," Heinrich called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes red with tears. "Heinrich, what are you doing here?" I was concerned about you. You seem troubled lately." Mrs. Brennan's face crumpled. "I cannot bear it any more, Heinrich. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Father Koller says it is sin, but I cannot help what I feel for him. Better to end it than to live with this disgrace." Heinrich realized with growing horror that Emma's observations about Mrs. Brennan and Father Koller had been accurate, and that the elderly woman was indeed contemplating suicide rather than face the scandal. He spent the next 2 hours talking Margaret Brennan away from the river, convincing her that shame was not worth dying for and that the community's judgment would eventually fade. When he returned home that evening, he found Emma making final notations in her journal. "Mrs. Brennan did not follow through with her plan," she observed clinically. "The intervention changed the probability calculation. I will need to adjust my variables for future predictions involving third-party interference." Heinrich stared at his daughter in disbelief. Emma had somehow observed and calculated a suicide attempt that had not yet occurred, and now she was treating his intervention as simply another data point to be incorporated into her mathematical models. The realization that his 11-year-old daughter was not just predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment filled him with a horror he could not name. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in her narrow bed, Heinrich and Greta made a decision that would change their lives forever. They could not continue living in Milwaukee. Emma's abilities, whatever they were, had made their life in the German Quarter impossible. But more troubling was the growing realization that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior, but seemed to be losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. They began making quiet plans to leave Wisconsin, to find some place where Emma could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind might find a different outlet. But Emma was not finished with her calculations, and the most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As Heinrich lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the German Quarter settling into sleep, he could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had uncovered secrets that went far deeper than adultery and suicide attempts. The precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the growing complexity of her calculations all suggested that Emma had been watching and recording far more than anyone realized. And the most terrifying part was that she was still calculating. The revelation that would expose the darkest secret of Milwaukee's German Quarter came on the first day of May, 1873. Emma had been making increasingly complex calculations in her journal, creating elaborate charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of virtually every adult in their community. Her parents had begun packing their belongings in preparation for leaving Wisconsin, hoping to escape before Emma's next prediction could destroy more lives. But that morning, as spring sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, Emma made an announcement that would shake the very foundations of their community. "Papa," she said, looking up from her journal with those calculating gray eyes, "I need to show you something important. My calculations have revealed a pattern that explains everything." Heinrich, who had been dreading this moment for weeks, reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. Emma opened her journal to a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a trained investigator than an 11-year-old child. "For 26 months, I have been observing and recording the behavior patterns of 43 adults in our community," Emma began with her characteristic clinical precision. "Initially, I believed the patterns were random variations, but when I analyzed the data systematically, I discovered correlations that indicate organized criminal activity." Heinrich felt his blood run cold. "Emma, what are you saying?" Emma consulted her charts with the methodical precision of a mathematics professor. 7 men in our community have been meeting secretly every Wednesday at midnight in the basement of Kellner's brewery. I calculated their movement patterns based on observed deviations from normal behavior, timing inconsistencies in their stated activities, and physical evidence of their gatherings. She pointed to a detailed map of the German Quarter marked with symbols and measurements. "Mr. Steinberg tells his wife he works late on Wednesday nights, but he leaves the mill at exactly the same time as the other 6 men and walks to the brewery using a route that avoids the main streets. The pattern has been consistent for 26 months, with only 3 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies." Heinrich stared at the map, recognizing the names Emma had marked. Wilhelm Weber, Franz Kellner, Ernst's brother, Hans Zimmermann, Franz's cousin, Otto Steinberg, Klaus Brennan, Margaret's deceased husband until 3 months ago, Gustav Wolf, and Hermann Kruger. "Emma, how could you possibly know about secret meetings?" "I observe everything, Papa. Every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns." Emma turned to another page filled with numerical calculations. "But the meetings are not the most significant discovery. My calculations indicate these 7 men have been involved in systematic theft from the brewery operations, with estimated losses of approximately $47,000 over 26 months. Heinrich's hands began to tremble. The sum Emma mentioned represented more money than most families in the German Quarter would see in a lifetime. "How could you calculate such a thing?" Emma's explanation was delivered with the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations. "I noticed discrepancies between the reported beer production figures and the actual output I calculated based on observed deliveries, ingredients purchased, and waste disposal patterns. The difference indicated systematic theft, but I needed to identify the perpetrators." She pointed to detailed charts tracking the behavior patterns of the 7 men. These individuals all showed consistent patterns of increased spending that did not correlate with their reported incomes. Mr. Weber purchased new furniture worth approximately $300. Mr. Steinberg sent money to relatives in Germany. I observed him at the post office 12 times with packages too large for normal correspondence. The pattern was consistent across all 7 men. Heinrich realized he was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 11-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis. But Emma was not finished with her revelations. The theft operation required inside knowledge of brewery security and access to the financial records. Emma continued, "My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in management. The patterns pointed to Ernst Kellner himself as the organizer of the theft ring. The final piece of Emma's revelation hit Heinrich like a physical blow. Ernst Kellner, the brewery owner who had been gradually freezing them out of the community, was allegedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 7 men from their neighborhood. The precision of Emma's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation all pointed to a truth that was both incredible and terrifying. Emma, these are very serious accusations. Are you certain of your calculations? Emma consulted her journal one final time. The mathematical probability is 96%. But Papa, there is something else. Something that explains why Mr. Kellner has been trying to isolate our family from the community. Heinrich felt his chest tighten with dread. What do you mean? Mr. Kellner knows that I observe everything. He has been watching me watch him. 3 weeks ago, he approached our house twice at night and stood outside for 17 minutes each time, as if calculating whether I might have discovered his secret. His behavior indicates he suspects I know about the theft operation. The realization that Emma's mathematical abilities had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy, but had also made her a target filled Heinrich with a terror he had never experienced. His daughter's obsessive observations and calculating mind had revealed secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. Emma closed her journal and looked at her father with those unsettling gray eyes. Papa, my calculations indicate that we are in significant danger. Mr. Kellner and the others cannot allow me to continue making observations. The mathematical probability of them taking action against our family is 84%, with peak likelihood occurring within the next 72 hours. Heinrich understood that Emma's final prediction was not about fire or suicide or adultery, but about their own family's survival. Her mathematical mind had uncovered a truth that made their continued existence in Milwaukee impossible, and the men she had exposed would not hesitate to eliminate the one witness who could destroy them all. That evening, Heinrich made a decision that would save his family's life. Using the detailed evidence Emma had compiled in her journal, he approached Dr. Müller under cover of darkness and shared Emma's discoveries. The physician, who had already been disturbed by Emma's unusual abilities, was stunned by the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation. Heinrich, if what Emma has calculated is true, we are looking at the largest theft operation in Milwaukee's history, Dr. Müller whispered as he examined the journal by lamplight in his office. But more importantly, if Kellner suspects that Emma knows, your family is in mortal danger. Dr. Müller agreed to help them escape Milwaukee immediately. Using his medical connections, he arranged for Heinrich to receive an emergency job offer at a brewery in distant Minnesota, providing cover for their sudden departure. They would leave that very night, before Emma's 72-hour prediction could come to pass. As the Richter family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Müller's wagon under cover of darkness, Emma made one final observation that would haunt Heinrich for the rest of his life. Papa, in approximately 6 months, the theft operation will be discovered through other means. Mr. Kellner will face justice, but 3 of the 7 men will not survive the investigation. The mathematical probabilities are quite clear. Heinrich shuddered as he lifted his daughter into the wagon. Even as they fled for their lives, Emma was calculating the future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Her prediction would prove accurate in every detail. By winter, a federal investigation would expose the theft ring, Ernst Kellner would be arrested and convicted, and 3 of his accomplices would die under suspicious circumstances that were never fully explained. But on that dark May night in 1873, as their wagon rolled through the sleeping streets of Milwaukee's German Quarter, Heinrich could only think about how his daughter's extraordinary mathematical mind had both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America. The Richter family vanished from Milwaukee in the early hours of May 2nd, 1873, leaving behind only whispered stories and unanswered questions. Dr. Müller reported that they had received an emergency family summons back to Bavaria, but the few people who bothered to ask noted that no ship passenger records could be found to confirm their departure from America. What the residents of the German quarter never learned was that Heinrich, Greta, and Emma Richter had indeed traveled to Minnesota, where Heinrich found work at a small brewery in the town of New Ulm. Dr. Muller had sworn to keep their location secret, understanding that Emma's mathematical abilities would always make her a target for those who feared exposure of their secrets. In New Ulm, the Richter family attempted to build a new life far from the whispers and fears that had driven them from Milwaukee. Heinrich found the brewery work familiar and satisfying, while Greta slowly began to rebuild the domestic routines that had been shattered by Emma's disturbing predictions. But Emma herself remained unchanged. Her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record human behavior patterns with the same mechanical precision that had made her both famous and feared. Dr. Muller maintained correspondence with the family for several months, reporting that Emma had begun working with a mathematics professor at a nearby college who was fascinated by her unusual abilities. The professor, a German immigrant named Dr. Hermann Weiss, approached Emma's condition from a scientific rather than supernatural perspective, helping her understand and channel her observational skills in ways that might prove beneficial rather than destructive. But the most significant revelation came in November of 1873, when Dr. Muller received a letter from Heinrich containing Emma's final prediction about the Milwaukee theft operation. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, federal investigators had indeed uncovered Ernst Kellner's conspiracy. Kellner was arrested and convicted of embezzling over $50,000 from multiple brewery operations. Wilhelm Weber, who had been Kellner's primary accomplice, was found dead in his home under circumstances that were ruled a suicide, but which many suspected were something far more sinister. Otto Steinberg and Hermann Kruger also died within weeks of the investigation's conclusion. Steinberg in what appeared to be a drunken accident, and Kruger from what Dr. Muller diagnosed as a sudden heart attack that bore suspicious similarities to the symptoms of certain poisons. Emma's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy had been accurate in every detail, including her prediction that not all of the conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crimes. The precision of her calculations, even from hundreds of miles away and months in advance, confirmed what Heinrich had come to understand about his daughter's extraordinary and terrifying abilities. The German quarter of Milwaukee slowly recovered from the scandal and tragedy of 1873. The brewery theft investigation brought unwelcome attention from federal authorities, but it also exposed a level of corruption that had been quietly damaging the community for years. New families moved into the houses left empty by death and departure, and the tight-knit community gradually rebuilt itself around more honest foundations. But the story of Emma Richter, the pale girl with the calculating gray eyes who could predict death and expose secrets through mathematical observation, became part of the neighborhood's whispered folklore. Parents used her story to warn their children about the dangers of knowing too much, while adults quietly wondered what other secrets might be hiding behind the ordinary facades of their neighbors' lives. Father Koller, who had initially blessed Emma's abilities as divine gifts, later confessed to Dr. Muller that the girl's mathematical predictions had shaken his faith in ways he could not explain. The priest had begun to question whether some knowledge was too dangerous for human minds to possess, and whether Emma's condition represented a blessing or a curse that had been visited upon their community. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Milwaukee's German quarter intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the most disturbing historical cases America has to offer. Dr. Muller's final letter to the Richter family was written in the spring of 1874, nearly a year after their departure from Milwaukee. In it, he reported that the German quarter had largely returned to normal, but that Emma's story continued to circulate in whispered conversations among the older residents. He also shared a disturbing development that had emerged during the federal investigation of the brewery theft. Government investigators had discovered that Emma's journal, which Heinrich had left with Dr. Müller as evidence, contained mathematical calculations that extended far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy. Emma had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns throughout the entire German immigrant community, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. The federal investigators trained in criminal analysis were both impressed and disturbed by the sophistication of Emma's observational methods. "Your daughter's mind works in ways that professional investigators might envy," Dr. Müller wrote. "But I confess that I am grateful she is far from Milwaukee. The precision of her observations and the mathematical certainty of her predictions represent a kind of knowledge that I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess." The final mention of Emma Richter in any historical record comes from a brief notation in the New Ulm College Mathematics Department records from 1875. Professor Hermann Weiss reported that his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, but that her family had decided to relocate once again for personal reasons. After that entry, Emma Richter disappeared from history as completely as she had vanished from Milwaukee on that dark night in May of 1873. What happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision remains unknown. Some researchers have theorized that families like the Richters, possessing children with unusual abilities, deliberately maintained their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution. Emma's story represents one of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded in sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications. This mystery shows us that the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1873, Emma Richter's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. But modern science recognizes that conditions like savant syndrome, autism spectrum disorders, and hyperthymesia can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think Emma's abilities extended even further than what we discovered? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've ever encountered someone with similar extraordinary mental abilities. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. These historical cases remind us that the most frightening truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right mind to calculate their terrible secrets. The case of Emma Richter demonstrates that sometimes the most terrifying discoveries come not from supernatural forces, but from the relentless application of mathematical logic to human behavior. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that the patterns we think we hide may be visible to those who know how to look and how to count.